On April 8th, 2020, former Bernie Sanders campaign volunteer Sean Moorhead posted the following tweet, saying that if unemployment exceeds 30% and distrust of the political process becomes widespread, there's a danger that the United States will enter what historians call the cool zone. Will Menaker, one of the hosts of the Chapo Trap House podcast, retweeted during the 418th episode of Chapo, recorded on May 11th. He went into further detail.
This is the era of history that kids like to learn about first, because it's the most interesting.
We could have maybe taken an off-ramp to the slightly boring zone. But Matt, as you said over and over again, like a prerequisite to that, and it's not even a hard one in theory, is just offering an actual solution or like a something different, a change, like some sort of like basic help to people, or like offering like just anything that would make people's lives like easier, less stressful, less miserable, more free time, more money. Like, or just any alternative to like what everyone has just decided is like an immutable fact of life, which is the markets and the people in control of them. And if we've precluded like any possible alternative within our political system, then what we're going to end up with is the cool zone. This is the death of the American empire. But everyone else is watching this shit right now. Like you said, the wealthiest, most powerful country in human history is just basically shitting its insides right now because it can't do anything.
Defined by Urban Dictionary as a time period marked by a massive political, social, and economic emancipation as a result of a crisis arising from the failures of capitalism, i.e. a revolution, often preceding widespread abject poverty, increased socioeconomic inequality, an obscene accumulation of wealth by the rich due to ownership of the means of production, a distrust in the current political process under which people live, and the social issues arising therein. Since its initial international outbreak in March, COVID-19 has seen worldwide shutdowns, with initial pushes for solidarity amongst almost everyone, with some functioning better than others. This sadly ended up grinding to a halt, because while the rest of the world shut down, police brutality sure as hell did. In the end of May, the United States saw pent-up tension coming to the fore following the murder of George Floyd, leading to mass Black Lives Matter protests and a federal response of using troops in unmarked vans to whisk away dissenters. For better or worse, things seem to be in a constant state of flux from day to day, and seemingly anything good or terrible is possible. Things shut down to limit COVID transmission. There have been massive layoffs, leading to the largest contraction in the American economy since it's been measured. As a result, more people are available and inspired to action than when jobs, hobbies, and a full schedule with a sense of normalized complacency is there to occupy that space. And this is a cultural moment that will be portrayed for years to come, not unlike the way a lot of American media is fixated on World War II and the post-war era and the years following it. We're going to see this moment become a point referenced in the future that will likely shape not just pop culture, but the way our lives will work moving forward. This idea that we're existing in a unique moment isn't just in reference to the shared experience of pervasive uncertainty that humanity is collectively experiencing with this, but also the fact that this is a moment where the changes that we are experiencing have eroded at the foundations of expectations and truths that we knew were all kind of untrue at some level. This decline was already underway, but in order to keep things mostly functioning on a day-to-day basis, we needed to ignore things like the fact that medical care has become prohibitively expensive, how justice depends on the recipient, and how our system is pushing the pedal to the metal with regards to climate catastrophe. And yet, it seems necessary for our leaders to not address these issues because the same people who are at the roots of these causes are connected to them. In some cases, directly profiting off of dysfunction. Like a terrible smell you forget is present until someone who isn't used to it enters the room and then gags. We've gotten used to this and forgotten it was even there. If you have pets, that metaphor probably hits very close to home. While there's a near universal desire to return to that old normal, that's currently not possible without there being massive casualties. Some people, like Congressman Dan Patrick, however, are at the point of pretty much asking people to throw themselves in the mouth of Moloch, like in the movie Metropolis, in the hopes of restarting the economy. This seems insane, but if you look at the death by 1,000 cuts the American living standard has been experiencing over the past few decades, this just kind of seems like a natural progression. If we were given the opportunity, these massive problems would not be something that we would choose. However, they've been normalized to an extreme degree over time, making the unacceptable seemingly palatable. This idea is not unlike the concept of hypernormalisation, an idea explored by British documentarian
Adam Curtis.
His 2016 documentary titled after the concept.
Those who ran the Soviet Union had believed that they could plan and manage
a new kind of socialist society. But they had discovered that it was impossible to control and predict everything, and the plan had run out of control. But rather than reveal this, the technocrats began to pretend that everything was still going according to plan. And what emerged instead was a fake version of the society. The Soviet Union became a society where everyone knew that what their leaders said was not real, because they could see with their own eyes that the economy was falling apart. But everybody had to play along and pretend that it was real, because no one could imagine any alternative. One Soviet writer called it hypernormalisation. You were so much a part of the system that it was impossible to see beyond it. The fakeness was hypernormal.
As Americans, we've seen people grow accustomed to what amounts to a system that we know is pushing falsehoods. Prior to the coronavirus, our system was already built on shaky ground, but for several reasons we've become numb to the severity and frequency of system-breaking crises or abuses that occur on a daily basis. With the rise of social media, users of those platforms have brought receipts to something that white Americans might have known on some level, but we're now forced to acknowledge in a new way. Though there's certainly a subset of white Americans that need to be dragged kicking and screaming into any debate over acknowledging any past failures. Recently, Taylor's ex, Jamarcus Glover, was arrested on an unrelated drug charge, and his lawyer came forward with documents showing that Glover was offered a plea bargain that he rejected, in exchange for naming Taylor in a case in the hopes of providing an after-the-fact justification for her murder. The fact that after actually assassinating Taylor, Louisville law enforcement attempted character assassination on her is insane. Whereas during the time of the Civil Rights Movement, there was a Supreme Court led by Chief Justice Earl Warren that was sympathetic to that movement. While Warren was instrumental in ensuring that citizens had constitutional protections while dealing with the police, like the right to a lawyer present during your questioning regardless of your income level, Black Lives Matter is also demonstrating it's possible to enact these types of legislation with things like chokehold bans and Breonna's Law, which makes no-knock warrants, like the one that contributed to Breonna Taylor's death, illegal. This is a start to achieving policy changes in order to rely on people like social workers who are trained in things like de-escalation in order to use the correct resources that a situation needs instead of sending police in and hoping they can wing it when they don't really have the proper training for a situation. It may be hard to imagine police differently than they are now, but people felt the same way when those reforms were being made with Warren's court. While the Occupy movement may have had some similar goals of reform, like Black Lives Matter, I guess, they weren't really organized. I recall personally having high hopes when I attended a rally myself. It started off acknowledging an untenable status quo, which I was totally for. When it came to addressing the lack of organization, it was palpable, and it came off as bad performance art, with any goodwill displaced by a drum circle with a white lady with dreadlocks pantomiming a spider at the center. Occupy was an Instagram-ready protest movement that gave up on the idea of social once everyone involved got a cool protest pic for a few moments of attention. The idea of having a vision and outlined goals is why the protests now are having an actual impact. It's a lot harder to dismiss a movement when it's in the direction of a goal. It's important to remember that protests and riots occur because there's a great deal of tension that's built up with no place to go. Like Dr. King said, riots are the language of the unheard, and they wouldn't occur if our society would listen. And absent an actual dialogue, this is an attempt to start one. In some places, this dialogue has led to reforms like what I mentioned earlier. It's also important to remember that for as much as people love Martin Luther King Jr. now, he was very disliked by a majority of Americans when he was alive. And depicted like this, when now he's arguably one of the safest figures one could possibly quote, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on. Our status quo is increasingly one where largesse for those who need it least is provided from the backs of more deserving recipients. Meanwhile, people like alleged Playboy Dan Bilzerian can live large off taxpayer funding. Bilzerian, whose $50 million company is predicted to fail, obtained a $1.2 million PPP loan right around the same time he was evicted from the house that Ignite actually ended up paying $2.4 million in rent annually on for him to live there, even though he claimed to actually own the house. I guess that kind of frivolous spending explains how their business could somehow fail while weed is having a renaissance. With the growth and diversity in the cannabis market, it's surprising they haven't been able to thrive. Though Forbes writer Chris Roberts points out that a disproportionate amount was spent on parties and events done towards branding. The Ignite website's Our Story page is also decidedly on brand with the same type of comical overcompensation one expects from Dan Bilzerian, with the failing business touted as a global lifestyle brand, unlike any other. Ignite combines premium quality ingredients with an unprecedented level of ambition, innovation, and an uncompromised standard of excellence. Inspired by its CEO and founder, Dan Bilzerian, Ignite has positioned itself as the gold standard and industry expert, and that Ignite is unapologetic in our attitude and our promise to provide the ultimate experience to our customers. Before ending on, it will always be the best or nothing for Ignite. Which, based on the way things are going, is entirely accurate, though probably not in the way they intended. It's cool though. We're all footing the bill since they're also applying for loan forgiveness. At the same time that people like Danny B are blowing through taxpayer funds meant for small businesses, Congress took a recess without giving many Americans the extra weekly $600 they've grown to rely on with these unprecedented times. When one factors in that there's the highest unemployment crisis in modern history and a looming eviction crisis unlike anything we've ever seen, it doesn't seem too ludicrous to think that we're within sight of the collapse of our current system. Whereas in the past there's been an ability to pretend that things are functioning as intended, this crisis has put things on their head, and truths that we could previously lie to ourselves about are impossible to avoid as our system collapses. In response to high joblessness, a number of people have been put on unemployment during the crisis, and surprisingly, a number of people have found that the unemployment pays better than the jobs they actually had before then, resulting in conservatives howling up a storm about how unemployment pays too much, when in reality, the wages that people had learned to survive on were too low and not actually sustainable. Large parts of MLK's message have been whitewashed in order to make it less threatening to white people, to the point that they have no problem white-splaining it on Twitter to his own son. This is because for many shitty white guys who don't actually know black people, Martin Luther King Jr. has become an imaginary black friend, or Bagger Vance construct for them to excuse their own bad takes and shitty behavior, with the most recent example being Jerry Falwell Jr., who quoted Martin Luther King Jr.'s Free at Last speech as he resigned from Liberty University after embezzling money to buy a gym and hostel for men who were involved with he and his wife, saying he is free at last, thank God Almighty I'm free at last. Also going on to say, I'm leaving because I think I've done all I can do. It's better to leave at the top. Which is an odd thing for him to say after being disgraced and having to step down from his family's religious university, while somehow managing to drag his beloved civil rights leader into the whole ordeal on his way down, and also make the Mighty Gemstones Season 1 plot seem like the PR version of the story that they would have preferred to actually get out. However, probably the most egregious component that gets ignored when people discuss MLK's legacy is also one that persists today, and that is the idea of economic justice. One of Dr. King's last rallies focused on this, with him saying, "It is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages, working on a full-time basis and a full-time job getting part-time income." Dr. King called for an economic bill of rights as part of his Poor People's campaign that described conditions remarkably similar to today's, saying that, in spite of years of national progress, the plight of the poor is worsening. Medical care is virtually out of reach of millions of black and white poor. White America has allowed itself to be indifferent to racial prejudice and the economic ripple effects from these issues, treating them as superficial blemishes, but now awakes to the horrifying reality of a potential fatal disease. I've included a link to his essay in the description so it can be read in full detail. Very recently, we were reminded of how stark the differences for white and black America are when in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in a single week, a black man was shot in the back 7 times in front of his 3 children, while a young white man was able to carry an illegally obtained AR-15 he brought across state lines to defend a stranger's property. But if we're being honest, to use this as an excuse to be a school shooter while everybody's having Zoom classes. But again, this is our normal of how treatment of suspects based on race actually plays out. The fact that we're existing in the cool zone by happenstance provides us with an opportunity to change things in a way that we normally couldn't. In some instances, quarantine has created solidarity, reignited old creative partnerships while also helping to create new ones. A momentary drop in emissions has seen some places seeing significantly less smog, with some people, including yours truly, finding themselves using other means of transportation for most trips or just cutting cars out of their lives completely. We have the power to say, before we go back to normal, that we need to make our collective new normal sustainable, because we're quickly approaching the point of no return for our climate that will leave it abnormal compared to what we may realize too late we have taken for granted. As we attempt to return to some sense of a new normalcy, in the face of growing crises, we need to address how we work and how to address some of the faults that are making coronavirus much more painful in the US and elsewhere. This means having discussions about post-capitalism, universal basic income, and how to go about investing in our future. Following the Black Death, a shortage of labor and abundance of land broke the way that feudalism had functioned and led to a renegotiation of terms on how society worked. The old inputs no longer work the same way, so a paradigm shift led to most people negotiating their living standards upwards as both wages and lifespans increased, as peasants were able to move out of the brutality of feudalism and into agrarian capitalism. What we're seeing now could potentially be another shift to whatever comes after capitalism. As frustration compounds and people grow angrier at one another about ways to proceed, it's impossible to ignore the catch-22 of opening in an environment when people are not going to be participating in the economy in a way that can support businesses. The current plan is to basically force restaurants to try and survive with just half of their revenues coming in, while still having many unadjusted expenses. If we were really serious about reducing the number of cases of COVID-19, as well as the number of businesses closed, we would do something along the lines of a lot of the rest of the industrialized world and put incentives in place for businesses not to fire employees, since rehiring and training people presents additional costs. We can see here the American approach is vastly different and seems to focus on putting a band-aid on things after the fact, instead of providing preventative support so everything doesn't burn down. By focusing on this aspect, instead of unemployment insurance or stimulus checks, other countries have managed to reduce the overall unemployment rate and the pressure that finance put on the spread of the virus. If we look at transmission rates in countries where they've done this, we can see this bearing true. Were we to try something similar here, we would remove that economic pressure of losing one's job that forces people into situations where they're more likely to actually spread coronavirus and thus extend the shutdown as well as its economic destruction. Instead, it appears that herd immunity is on the table again, despite this strategy being utterly destructive in Sweden. It seems backwards that tax revenue can be used to fund advancements that lead to private tech, and even worse in this crisis, pharmaceutical companies, to make billions of dollars, while we do nothing to help the same people that actually made this progress possible. Taxpayers invested $99 million, while Gilead Pharmaceuticals, who produced the drug, has decided to charge that same tax-paying public $3,100 for a course of treatment. Our leadership is willing to provide a variety of help in these trying times, just not to the people who paid for it. We live in the richest country in history, where a large amount of those gains have been made off of collective investments like NASA or the development of the internet, and yet our country seems irrationally averse to paying dividends out to the people who paid for their development. Many of the most successful companies like Apple or Tesla are only able to achieve that success because of things that taxpayers helped fund to create, and yet we don't bat an eye when those same companies do everything in their power not to pay back in the system that helped create their wealth. In case you thought this was anything new, check out this political cartoon from the robber baron era, depicting the way in which corporatism ran amok, while anything resembling a safety net for the public was chastised as socialism. Despite it being 2020, a lot of American culture is still a throwback to the post-war era, with our economy and infrastructure still built out to reflect cheaply priced oil. America is spread out with a highway system that requires a car and few other options to use it, and a lack of good public transit has made transportation another form of economic stratification that has made mere movement a flex of one's wealth. Post-war ideals have been preserved since then by leaders who are guided by nostalgia for an idealized version of that era that ignores any faults, whether it was the increased danger from collision or pollution, or the ways that things like highways were able to reinforce segregation. Just like the post-war era when our society built its identity and functionality on cheap oil, we can take this moment and actually build a forward-thinking system with equality, accessibility, and sustainability in mind, and kick off a new, even cooler era that's more up-to-date than the post-war one that America's stuck in. Just like in the post-war era when our society built its identity and functionality on cheap oil, we can take this moment and build a forward-thinking system with equality, accessibility, and sustainability in mind, and kick off a new, cooler era that's more up-to-date than the post-war era that America's stuck in. Oil is no longer as cheap as we thought it was, now that we've experienced unforeseen consequences. There's an urgency here too, because if we don't put forward a plan, then Trump and his cabinet of profiteering disaster capitalists will. In my next video, I'm going to talk about what disaster capitalism is, how it's taking place right now with coronavirus, and what can be done to stop it. If you like this, Give me a like and subscribe, and make sure you don't miss the next video. If you want to learn more about how internet infrastructure in America is lacking and why, or how municipal broadband is the answer, click here. Until then, take care of yourself, and I hope to see you again.
I think that progress is not possible without deviation. And I think that it's important that people be aware of some of the creative ways in which some of their fellow men are deviating from the norm.